in most other choices in our life, we never say that. Like, we don't say to people, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no to like a job that we're considering or getting married or any of these other big decisions. We allow ambivalence and confusion, but for some reason with like having kids or not, we believe, I think because it's like, biology and other things, that you should never have like a negative emotion or you should never question it. Yeah. And that means something bad about you.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Now, as you'll hear me share in just a few minutes, there are so few people that I actually hear talking about being on the fence about kids or not. And that's one of the big things that kept me stuck, was just feeling so lonely and shameful and feeling really without support in this big decision. And so despite the fact I've now come to my decision and I've realized there are some other coaches and therapists who help people with this decision, I still don't hear people talking about the experience of being on the fence about kids very often. And so that's why I was so delighted to come across this person and this account, and I knew I had to have her on to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Amanda E. White is a licensed therapist and the creator of the popular Instagram account Therapy for Women. She writes a Substack called Fence Sitter, and she is the author of the book Not Drinking Tonight and its corresponding workbook. Amanda is the founder of the group therapy practice Therapy for Women Center, based in Philadelphia, serving clients across the country. Amanda has been featured in notable publications such as Forbes, Washington Post, Shape, Women's Health Magazine, and more. All right. Thank you so much for being here, Amanda. I'm really excited that you are coming on here for a few reasons. Perhaps first and foremost is because you have been so open about your own experience of having been on the fence, trying to make this big decision of whether or not to have a child. And I just think, these are the stories that we need to be hearing more of from people. And then second to that, you are a therapist. You run a business called an account, a massive Instagram account, which people definitely need to check out, called Therapy for Women. So you know a lot about what makes us women tick, the pressures that we face, not just how difficult that this particular decision is to navigate, but aside from being a woman yourself, you really know the inner lives of women. So I'm very grateful that you are on the Kids Are Childfree podcast. I know you're going to share a lot of wisdom with us today. And as is customary with all our guests, first of all, in your words, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. You hit some of the main points. But yeah, I recently had a child. My daughter is 14 months old now. And I was on the fence for a few years and really struggled with that. I felt like there is just a lot of polarization, especially on social media of, I would watch these TikToks and Instagrams of people, crying about feeling like this was horrible that they had kids. And I got to the point where I just felt like, why are people even having kids? Do I even want this? And it also became something that as a therapist, I got really interested in researching. So I started reading books and studies about it. And naturally, the universe kind of works this way. A lot of my clients were trying to decide that. So yeah, it just became a topic that I'm really passionate about talking. And I just started a new Substack called Fence Sitter. So I love kind of bringing my personal experience, but also my professional experience clinically to this topic.
Well, I have to say with the Fence Sitter Substack, I'm really enjoying reading it. And it's actually something I've been sharing with clients as well, because I, of course, as much as I think we try not to bring any sort of bias to this decision-making process, I am not a mother. I've decided to remain child-free. Yeah. And so, I shared just your most recent article yesterday inside our group program, because I think it's so important to have these perspectives of people who are on the fence who did decide for motherhood. And so, I really appreciate that. And I'm learning from you as well. So, okay. So I'm curious to hear. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to just quickly mention before we get into the nitty gritty of your decision. I very much agree with this notion of how polarized things seem where it concerns this decision, especially in the social media landscape. And I, had a comment literally 5 minutes before this episode that we're recording. Somebody had said on one of my posts that I'd gotten quite a bit of traction, a lot of comments some of which we'll maybe address today. Like, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. And if you think you're not sure, it means it's a no, and all these things. And what this person's comment was she said, there's so many comments on this post that are looking at things so black and white. And she said, we as women get enough of that everywhere else. Can there please be a space where we can be in the gray zones? And I was like, yeah, sister. Amen. And I'm here to support, of course, all the comments that I get. And, probably similar to yourself, there's comments from people who have decided to be parents. There are people who have always been affirmatively child-free, but I had to like give her the thumbs up and just say, thank you for saying that, because this gray zone and the fact that life isn't dichotomous, life is operating in those in-betweens. That's something that is so seldom addressed. So, okay, back over to you. So tell me, you mentioned you were on the fence for a few years. I'm curious, when you were younger, either as a girl growing up or entering early adulthood, did you know you wanted to have kids?
Yeah. So I just always assumed I would have kids, but I never actually thought about what it would be like. I knew I never wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. I saw my mom go through that, and she gave up her career, and I think it really negatively impacted her mental health. And she kind of used to always tell me, don't give up your career. And I was lucky that I found a career I was passionate about. So I just assumed it, but I never felt this calling to be a mother. I didn't really love babies growing up. I was kind of a kid growing up that often also was considered like old for my age, wise beyond my years. I didn't really enjoy babysitting. So I think that also, looking back, I kind of had this moment of, do I actually want kids? Or was I just conditioned? No one asked me when you're young, like, do you want kids? They were just like, oh, when you have kids, what do you want to name your kids? And I think that's a really important thing for people to think about.
100%. And isn't that funny, the naming thing? That's like one of the biggest things we focus on, which is, I mean, we can argue or say like a name is important. It helps inform how a person becomes, but like it's so superficial compared to the ins and outs of having and raising a child. Okay. So now tell me, you were in a relationship, you're married, is that correct?
I am, yes.
Okay, and so when did you meet your partner, and how were your feelings about kids then?
Yeah. So when I met my partner when I was 26, and I knew I wanted to get married. I'd always been someone who dreamed of a wedding, wanted a partner. I mean, I like went through, when in my 20s, like reading all the books, buying dating coach, programs, all of that, very obsessed with finding a partner. And I always knew I wanted to be a wife. But for me and for my partner, we always were kind of like, marriage and children are separate things. They're not the same for us. And I think we had both said that we probably would have kids, but we weren't 100% committed. And once I was getting married, I witnessed a lot of my friends all having kids right after they were getting married, or they were pregnant and then they got married quickly. And I was very frustrated and felt very confused about like, why are you doing this? These are two separate things. It was very important for me to be married, to live with, to be with my husband for quite a few years, and then decide whether I wanted kids, because I wasn't sure. And to me, they were two separate things. And I wanted to be able to try my marriage out, because you can get out of being married. You can get divorced where you can't unhave kids.
Yeah. Oh gosh. First of all, like, I appreciate how sort of pragmatic you are. I'm sure there's people maybe listening being like, you can get out of a marriage. What kind of attitude is that to go into? But my husband and I are the same way. And actually we didn't marry we'd been together 10 years. And it's funny what you say about like basically kind of separating out marriage from children. And I think we decided not to marry. And ultimately it was like, people don't like when I say this, a visa wedding. Like I live in Germany. He's German.
Yeah.
It made life simple. Yes, I do love him, of course. But we're very pragmatic, where we're like, we love each other. We hope to be together until the day we die.
Right.
But if things change, if this isn't a relationship that serves both of us, then, and we work on things, of course, that's maybe something like it ends. Okay. So I appreciate that attitude. It's interesting that I was reluctant to marry for so long, because part of me wonders subconsciously if it's like, now you're the therapist, but because these two things are so intertwined, and because such a part of me was like resisting and not really wanting to have kids, I wonder if it was like, would be that logical conclusion, or if I thought about that.
It
which,
totally could be.
similarly for us, it's like those two have always been separate things. But for so many people, and I'm sure, at the wedding where people are already making comments, questions, jokes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what was also really interesting, and this was an experience I had when I was pregnant, is I don't know if it was purity culture that I grew up in or just my family. Like, we didn't talk about sex. It was very not talked about. I was horribly uncomfortable once I got married, that there all of a sudden was this pressure, and people would be like, so are you going to start trying to have kids? When are you going to have kids? And I was like, you're asking me if I am having unprotected sex. Like, this is so uncomfortable. We would never talk about this. Just because we're calling it something different doesn't mean that's not what you're asking. And it was extremely difficult. Like, I think that was a big part of me deciding to and wanting to wait, was just, if I decided to have kids, I was very uncomfortable with the idea of people knowing that and being involved in any way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because obviously on the one hand, like, it's normal, healthy to have sex in our relationships with people. And at the same time, it is something so personal. And it is weird how we have kind of this like euphemism for it where we're like trying. It's like, are you getting it on? Are you having sex? Are you trying to make a baby? And I can see probably, especially from your upbringing, how like separating those things out and being like, why are we now all of a sudden talking about this? It must have been very strange. And it's there's a lot we can say about the questions and comments that people make around having kids. That's probably a whole other conversation, but it's probably generally inappropriate for a myriad of reasons. Okay, so you'd been with your partner then. How long were you together when I want to say like the pressure cooker really kind of like heated up and you were like, okay, I want to make a decision?
Yeah. So I would say, I think we'd been married like 1 or 2 years. I think people kind of give you a year sometimes. And then they're like, okay, let's, what are you doing? I also felt more pressure because my mom struggled a lot to have kids. So that was like a very normal conversation. She had told me a lot about that. She had struggled to conceive both times. So there was a lot of conversations about, it may take you a really long time to have kids. And that was a very big fear of mine because I just grew up, my parents always told us about how it was hard for them to conceive us. So yeah, that was something that was really hard. And I think it was also difficult because I started, my early 30s, I felt like I had a book come out. I felt like I was at the top of my career with my business. Things were really taking off, and I felt like, and now I have to slow down. Now I have to start deciding. In retrospect, I think I had way more time. I'm 34 now, but it started to feel like, I think what was so insane is when you're trying to decide if you have kids, you have to kind of be like, I need to be fine with getting pregnant tomorrow and having a child in 9 months, or, 1 to 5 years. And it's all normal and fine, and you don't have very much control over that. And that was really difficult for me.
Yeah, I can see that. And, I think I obviously in hindsight saying, okay, I could have waited longer. That's based on how things went and knowing what you know now. But I feel like, I know for me, I deferred the decision. But you never really stop thinking about it, right? Like, we can say like, oh, I'll wait. 35 was like the big magic number, which I know a lot of women have. Finally, I said, okay, 35, then I'll decide. Right. But you don't ever really stop exploring that. And it must just be, in a way, like having that clear-cut decision. I understand it's super hard for people to get to, but there is a point where it's kind of like, enough is enough. Forget about biology, which of course is super important, but regardless, I can see how it feels important to make that decision.
Yeah. And I think for me, I explored a lot of, what I really got down to is I was trying to be very pragmatic about it. I read lots of books. I watched videos about it. I interviewed my friends. I talked to my parents. I really wanted people to tell me, like, why have kids? Because everyone can tell you why not to have kids or what's so hard about it. But a lot of the reasons why to have kids are very vague and not helpful. They're just like, my kids are my life. And when you don't have kids, that doesn't mean anything to you. No. You're like, what does that mean? So that was a big struggle for me. And what I finally, through, my own personal work and journey and talking to my husband about it, was that there wasn't a practical, logical reason to have kids. I knew like in many ways my life would be harder and potentially worse, but I wanted to anyway. And that was kind of what I got to was I know it doesn't make sense, but I still want to. And the other part for me was I don't know if I want to have more than one child. And that helped me a lot with making the decision. And my partner and I are only going to have one child.
I want to agree with what you're saying, because I think we often do look to really like rationalize or reason the decision. You know, we do the pros and cons list, which you'd probably agree, bad idea. Like it's, we can't assign like weight or values to like one thing versus the other. I do think, you know, it's largely, I don't want to say it's largely emotional. I mean, of course it is, but there are aspects of that just, they're not tangible. And to your point, they're things that you can't really know until you have a child, which like, how did you contend with the idea that like all these things that parents are talking about are amazing? I won't actually know if that's true until I experience it. Like, how did you kind of think about that in your mind?
I think that was the hardest thing. I think that is the hardest thing about trying to decide if you want a child, because you can't take it back and you just have to kind of blindly trust that you'll love this child, especially if you don't love kids or you don't like, I didn't have any nieces or nephews. I mean, some of my friends had kids, but I didn't feel particularly close to any of my kids. I'm also a believer in like, you can use certain things, like certain circumstances can help you weigh the decision differently. So a big part of why I also decided I wanted to have kids was I knew my parents would be great grandparents and I wanted to be able to share that experience with them. If that weren't the case, maybe that I would have weighed the decision differently. If I had a lot of nieces and nephews, if my parents already were grandparents. And I think that's okay to be pragmatic in certain ways and weigh that decision. But yeah, the honest answer is for me, I love my dog so much. And I started thinking about how he's such a pain in the butt. Like this dog I have like a rescue dog who has like allergies and foot issues and just he doesn't like other dogs. He has so much work, but we love him so much and we love to do things with him that, you get to see him excited. And I started to think about how much joy I got from him. And I started thinking about, I think that's what people mean a bit with going to the zoo, even though you wouldn't like going to the zoo, but watching your child be excited about the zoo. That was a big thing that I think changed for me.
It's really interesting that you share that because I have a dog as well. And on the flip side for me, and I share this not to say, well, you're wrong, but to show that I think is actually a really potentially powerful tool and exercise for someone to do, because I similarly, love my dog to death. Like, the memes where it's like you're crying because your dog died, but your dog hasn't died yet, but you're like, and it's like 2 years old or something. Our dog's 10 now, but I can't even think about it. I'm like, she's going to live to be like 18. Yeah. There are dogs that live to be that old. P.S. But for me, actually, I think what's interesting is because people talk about like in a certain age kind of having that urge and people, oh, my ovaries ache. And we'll I think have some future guests on to talk about this notion of course we have biology and we do have biological clocks that pertain to like all kinds of things, feeling thirsty or tired. And I don't want to say that people's experiences that's not real. But there's obviously, of course, a lot of societal factors that play into that longing and what's happening around us. And so for me, interestingly, thinking about it now, our dog is 10. I'm 41. I got her in my early 30s. And it was really this, like, I wanted to have this dog. I wanted to have this creature, this being with me and my husband. And for us, of course, a couple can be a family, but I feel like our dog is what made us a family.
Yeah.
And it gave me enough of that it made me think, I love this, but I also don't want more as far as that like responsibility or even, the risk of loving, if you will. And I'm not ashamed to say that there's probably fear tied up in that. So interesting. I think there's probably some powerful questions people can explore there if they have a pet to say, what's my relationship like with that animal? And how would I feel if I like took it up a notch, many notches?
Well, that's really what I love about this topic too, is the same thing can happen to people or the same question. You can ask the same question and people have totally different responses. And to me, that is such like a clear indication that not everyone is meant to have kids.
Yeah.
Like people a lot of times when I'm working with people, they'll say, I knew because someone in my life died. And I just woke up and was like, oh my God, I have this insane urge. Life is short. I must have a child. And then other people are like, life is short. I must travel. I can't tie myself down more.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so beautiful about it. And it's where I get very frustrated when people try to pigeonhole people into one or another. I really think it's logistical, but it's also values based and personality based. And only we can decide for ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. Oh my gosh. And I relate so much to the example that you gave. And I saw that in my own family, that when just before my dad died, my brother was like, I need to make a baby with my partner.
Yeah.
And luckily, I shouldn't say luckily, timing was perhaps not great. So they put the brakes on, but now I'm proud auntie and they have a son. For me, the experience of losing my dad after a really long disability, which I've talked about, if anyone's interested, they can listen to episodes 5 and 6, a bit more about my story. But it actually threw into question a lot of the assumptions that we have in terms of like getting older, who's taking care of us, what our relationships look like, and not in a bad way. I don't want to say it's given me like, I'm not like a glasses half empty kind of person, but it is interesting. My response to it was very different. And what I took away from it is also very different. And of course, that has to do with like my lived experience of that versus my brother and et cetera. So, okay. So many good thoughts. I'm like, my brain is racing right now. Okay. So I'm curious to know, you mentioned, of course, you have your husband. He was also, and it sounds like kind of ambivalent or thinking like eventually, but not yet. What did the conversation look like with him in terms of making this decision, the timing of it, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there were a couple like logistical things in terms of us kind of deciding where we wanted, because we worked together. We wanted the business to be in a certain place. We wanted to feel like we could step back a little bit. I mean, not that you ever totally can, but there were some logistical like metrics we essentially wanted to hit before we started having that conversation. He's also 4 years older than me. So that was part of the conversation where if he wouldn't have been, I definitely think I would have wanted to wait. But we kind of got to this, point too, where he was kind of feeling like if we're going to have kids, I don't want to be too old. I want to be able to be around for them and things like that. So that was part of our conversation as well. I mean, to be totally honest, and I talk about this and I feel like this is controversial to talk about, but a big reason we also got to was we kind of felt like we should make a decision, because if all of your friends have kids, they're kind of moving into a different life phase, and you kind of reach this point where I think if you don't want to have kids, that's great. And I think though it's helpful to make friends with people who don't have kids additionally, or, invest in hobbies, find other things to really fulfill you. And I think we were in this place where we hadn't decided not to have kids. So we weren't fully investing in that, but we hadn't had kids yet. So we kind of felt a little listless, a little bored sometimes, like we didn't know how to spend our time on the weekends. It's not really fun to go hang out with friends with kids when you don't have kids. So we weren't really into that. So I think that was like a part of it too, is we kind of felt like we either need to really decide we're not going to have kids and start building that life, or we are going to have kids and we can start building this different life. And I think that that's an important thing for people to think about too, because I think that when people hear what I say, I think sometimes they can be like, well, that's a reason to have kids. Your friends are having kids, grow up, move on. And really, it's not about whether you should have kids or not. It's just that if you're choosing not to have kids, and I'm sure you can attest to this, you need to start investing in that part of your life as well. Or you are just going to feel like, bored or listless or whatever.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think once you make a decision, a lot of people without kids think about like me, for example, being confidently, affirmatively child-free as being the same as them having not yet decided. But it's maybe similar in terms of how we spend our time. But I think like the mindset is different. And I think you have a different vision for your future and in terms of where you're investing your time and energy and the kinds of relationships. And, of course, certainly we have many friends. I shouldn't say, of course, some child-free people like would prefer not to have that many friends with kids for whatever reasons. We have many friends with kids, but also, I think for me specifically, probably based on gendered expectations and whatnot, child-free friendships have been something that I've really like needed to lean into and that I've wanted to develop. And so I totally get what you're saying. And people like to misconstrue everything. I don't take that as like, oh, if your friends are having kids, you should, and we did because they did. But it was more like, it sounded like you were like very much leaning that way. There was still, of course, reluctance, which I want to talk more about. Like, what was the reluctance and the fear that you were feeling? And it sounded more like a putting it off. I don't want to say it was just a timing matter. You, of course, were definitely on the fence about things, but it's like you were sort of in this like no man's land of like, okay, I'm just getting swept along with what people are doing. How can we make a decision that can then like bring us in the same channel, so to speak? And, our kids grow up together. We do the trips together. And like, of course you can have friends with kids of drastically different ages, but I can see it being really nice that they're in similar sort of boats that way.
Yeah, I think for me, the process was when we were first married, I spent a couple years truly being on the fence and kind of being on the fence with my husband.
Okay.
And then after researching and doing some of my own work, therapy, I realized, I still wanted them. And I think it was really fear that was holding me back. So then I had made the decision and we were just trying to figure out timing. And I remember we had taken a trip after, I think COVID also really impacted me because I had these ideas of, I want to do all these things before I have kids. And all of us were locked up and didn't do anything. We didn't travel. And I remember the first trip we took after COVID, I was like, I should freeze my eggs. We need to travel way more. We need to do this. And that, ultimately my partner and I kind of compromised. And because he's older than me, we decided to wait a couple years, but not wait quite as long. But I think I just got clear that I really wanted them too, because I was very afraid of deciding I wanted kids and not being able to have them. And that fear of, I ultimately decided I'd rather have them earlier than maybe I was 100% ready than not be able to. I was very scared of that.
Yeah.
And that was telling for me in terms of, well, which decision am I going to regret more? And it was clear to me that not having the opportunity to have them, I would regret more or be more afraid of happening.
Yeah, that's such a good sort of like pulse check, if you will. If somebody's leaning towards having kids, but they keep putting it off, thinking I'm not ready, the timing's not right. And we can maybe speak to that in a second, because I know you wrote a great post about like being prepared, and there is some importance in preparation, of course, if you're planning to have a child. But I like this idea of, okay, if I like weighing out the risks and saying, okay, but if I am not ready and then that means it's too late, like which is going to feel worse for me, or what am I going to regret? Well, I'd regret it. I'd rather than do things a bit earlier. So that's a great question you asked. So I'd love to tell you that once I decided to stay child-free, that was it. That was the end of the story. I'd made my decision, life was good, and I never looked back. But that's not entirely true, because in fact, even once I consciously decided that child-free was a path for me, I still had lingering doubts for quite some time about whether I really was choosing the right path, whether I might in fact regret it when I got older. I worried about where I could find my place in the world and whether I might truly stay and remain fulfilled in my child-free life. And it took time to come to confidence and to feel really secure in the choice. And through that process, what I realized in doing this work as well is that there's a lot of other child-free women who feel this way. Women who are pretty sure or almost sure or like 95% certain that they don't want to have kids, and yet they still keep second guessing their choice. They keep going in circles. They might feel like, they go and spend time with friends who have kids and suddenly they're spiraling and thinking, is that the right decision for me? Or they go to a family event and people start asking them about their child-free choice and they start to second guess themselves. If you can relate to anything that I'm sharing here, I want to invite you to check out Confidently Child-Free, which is my 3-month group coaching program for women who are almost sure they want to stay child-free and they really want to go from feeling shaky to rock solid in their child-free choice. Through this process that I will take you through, where you'll find yourself alongside like-minded child-free women who are in the same boat as you are, I'm going to help you really solidify the feeling that child-free is in fact that right choice for me. We're going to talk about everything ranging from later in life as a child-free person, to how you can build child-free community, to helping you uncover any lingering doubts that might be there so you can finally form a solid, confident belief that this is in fact the path that can lead you to a really good, fulfilling life, because I know that's the case. If you're interested and want more details, we're going to be kicking off our summer session in mid-July, so I will include the details in today's show notes of our episode, or you can find them over at kidsorchildfree.com under the group programs or under the Work With Me tab, which you'll then find the group programs tab, and you'll find all the info there. Again, the show notes is probably the best place to find the info on Confidently Child-Free. All right, let's get back to today's episode. Okay, I'm trying to think here. I want to hear about what specifically you were afraid of when you talked about, like, I was really in fear and that question helps you, but what were you specifically afraid of?
I was terrified of regretting having a kid. That was my biggest fear, is because I didn't have a lot of experiences of loving kids, being around kids. I had a lot of friends also who, like I have a couple friends who literally would pull me aside and be like, I'm miserable. This is horrible. Like, I am struggling. And I would look at them and be like, oh my God, is this, I had a good childhood, but like I had kind of said, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She gave up her career. She really, really struggled to take care of us. And it was very, very evident. And I just never wanted to put my kids or child in that position where I shouldn't have had them. I regretted it. I wasn't happy to be around them. I think I was very like, I need to be able to be as good of a mom as I can be.
Yeah.
I also get overstimulated very easily. Like going to like when I've spent time with my friends' kids, it didn't seem fun. It didn't seem like a good activity to do. And everyone tells you, oh, your kids are different, but it is so hard to imagine that being true. And on some level, it is, but I do still get overstimulated by her. I took my child to the beach like a month ago, and we lasted for like 30 minutes and it wasn't fun. But I also think my husband and I, through these conversations, we kind of were like, we also get to choose how we live our life. We get to choose if we have more than one. We get to choose whether, we stay home or whether we, continue to work. We get to choose if we decide that it's not like my child hasn't been on an airplane yet, because going on an airplane with her and going on vacation with her sounds horrible. Yeah. And, that's a choice that I get to make also. Yeah. So I think that was part of it too, I think it's hard when you see people that are so miserable not being scared of that happening to you. Yeah. But I think it's also important to remember that it is your life and you will get to make choices and decide what works for you and what doesn't.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think asking yourself, knowing, okay, because I think people see things, again, going back to those polarities we talk about, super black and white. They picture, okay, I have a child and it's like this maybe unimaginable scenario that I hate. Asking yourself, okay, what kind of control do I have there? Because yes, you may not, once you have a child, be able to control the fact that they're like here on this earth with you, but you can decide how you respond, what that relationship or, co-parenting looks like if you're in a partnership with somebody. You can decide, where you put your time and energy, what kind of hobbies, how much you take on, how you respond. Like, for you knowing, okay, I get overstimulated, you can have, is there a conversation with your partner? Like, okay, like this is like, I'm at a 9 out of 10, got to clear the room. You're stepping in. Like, I'm sure there are sort of tools you can bring into place if you are aware of what maybe some of these hurdles would be, or even if you aren't, to be able to then like go into damage control, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just being clear about, that was when I kind of wrote the post about what you can do to be prepared. I mean, I think it's also being really clear that what a child is and isn't going to do. And a child is not going to just fulfill you. A child is not going to make you happy all the time, right? Like, I think that sometimes we have unrealistic expectations. And I think that's what's interesting about, it's the great thing about social media, right? Is I do think people are more aware of the choice. They are walking into it with, eyes wide open a bit more, which is great, because I think that a lot of people maybe had kids in the past who didn't know how hard it was or weren't told these things and weren't prepared. So I do feel like I was prepared in that way. But I also think that it's important to recognize that just because you have moments of being overwhelmed, it's what we've been talking about. The gray, I think, is really, really needed.
I'm interested what sort of advice you would give to someone then who is worried that they're going to regret their decision. Either way, I mean, I've no, you're probably not surprised to hear it. I hear about this fear of regret a lot. It was one of my big ones. Of course, as someone choosing to be child-free, we hear you're going to regret your decision when you're old for all of these various reasons. So what would you say to someone who's really contending and grappling with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that regret is an interesting word. And I think people can get very often what's next to regret is people have this belief that there is a right decision, that there is a right and a wrong decision, and they just need to burrow deeply inside, and then this gold star of an answer will be revealed. And I'm a very big believer in there aren't right or wrong decisions. There's just the decision you make based on the information you have. And that was the best decision you could make at the time. And it's hard if you have new information, maybe you would choose differently. So I think it's worth exploring other regrets in your life. Like what do you tend to most commonly regret? What are your biggest fears about regret? Because I think sometimes people don't even really know what that means. Like when you're thinking about regret, is it that you're thinking about being on your deathbed? Is it thinking about regret 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because just because you have feelings on your deathbed that maybe you should have had a child, that also doesn't mean that you made the wrong decision either. I think we sometimes overly put a lot of emphasis on the idea of regret, as though it is just, I think a lot of us just have different regrets and things we wish we could do differently. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the wrong choice. The other thing I would say is I think that there is grief in all the choices. Like I think that there is grief when you choose to have a child. There's grief when you choose not to have a child. There is grief if you have one child and then you have another child. There is grief if you, however many kids you decide or don't decide. And I think that we often think this idea of feeling grief or feeling sadness means we made the wrong decision, when life is just full of grief and sadness, and you're a human being who's going to have different emotions. And I think it's really important that we normalize that, but we don't necessarily we don't have to add the meaning to it always.
I couldn't agree more. I think, the idea that any one decision is going to make you immune to very normal human emotions that we should be experiencing, as much as we may not like that, it's a total fallacy to think that. And I think it's a big part of what keeps people stuck. The irony being that there is misery and pain and discomfort and being in this middle ground for so long. And I think people need to explore that. If you're having effectively so much grief or anger or feeling lost or unsupported in this middle zone, that I don't want to say that deciding will bring relief. It certainly will in some sense. But life is ups and downs and all those things in between. And to characterize any one decision as being all good or all bad, I think is just a really simplistic way of looking at things.
Totally. And I think it kind of comes back to what I was saying too about how when you are in that middle ground, I think sometimes people literally are stuck and they don't invest in themselves, invest in hobbies, invest in certain things that would make their life child-free more fulfilling.
Yeah.
And I think it's not about that one decision is better than the other or one life is better than the other. I think it's the life you pick, and then I think it's the life you create, because I think both lives can be great. And maybe what we need to start saying is both lives can be great. Which one then do you pick?
Which great
if
life
both
do you
can
want?
be great.
I totally agree. Yeah, we're on the same page. I love you. It's like, you're just like me. You're amazing. No, I resonate so much with what you're saying. And it's just wonderful hearing it be put into words and different words in some sense, but like kind of homing in on the same point and takeaway, which, both paths can be beautiful and fulfilling, and all the things, the ups, the downs, the difficult, but that's life. And that's why life is so rich and meaningful.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions. I mean, the regret there, we could just talk about regret all day long. So first of all, when you talk about these like quote unquote miserable parents, people who approach you being like, oh my God, I'm like dying. This is terrible. I hate this. Do you see, and maybe based on some of the relationships you have with them, is that a moment in time, or do you think they really are very miserable in their decision?
Yeah. So I've become very interested in this topic actually. And I've been doing like research on it because it is so interesting, the idea of regret or the idea of people being miserable and things like that. Because I think in my assessment, a lot of times it is a moment in time. And you can, right, to make this topic even more nuanced, you can feel regret and not be regretful about your decision too, right? It's also an emotion. In my friends' experiences, I think a lot of times it was just overwhelm. It was too much. Maybe they didn't realize how much this would be. If you search Reddit, which I got very caught into searching on Reddit, right? Like regretful parents. It does sound like it's a lot of times a moment in time. And what I often, when I boil things down and what I see in the research is often it's not that people don't love their child. It is that being a parent is really, really hard. And the really unfortunate truth is like the less privilege you have, the harder it is. And a lot of times it's not that people don't love their children or regret their children. It's that they're very frustrated by the amount of labor that it takes to raise a child.
Yeah, 100%. And I also am very intrigued by the topic and have done quite a bit of like reading and research around it. And I mean, I think you pointed out something in one of your articles just to kind of add on that is that people who do characterize themselves as being regretful, which interestingly, I don't know if you've noticed this, but in a lot of the like research that's been done or surveys that have been conducted, the question is, would you choose that choice again? And to me, that's not the same as regret. To me, regret is I made a mistake, which you could say, well, if you made a mistake, you wouldn't do it again. But I think we can acknowledge that we would choose differently in like a different set of circumstances or life, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we regret it. For that, I just some food for thought for people listening.
Totally.
Do you agree with that?
I totally agree because I think what's hard is when you really regret something, you almost have to say, I'm okay, right? It's like the butterfly effect of you almost have to be okay with not your current life right now. And you would start again and you would do it again. And I agree. I think that's what's really hard. And I think it also just points to research is limited in terms of everyone interprets the word regret differently. So how do we get unbiased research when someone interprets it one way? And how do we quantify when someone says, I feel regretful today, or today I had a moment where I regretted having my kids, but most of the time I don't. Or, I think that's what's really interesting too, based on the studies. You kind of have to, I think the best studies are the ones where people look at their life and their kids are fully raised. And they say, do you regret having kids? Versus like you said, would you have chosen to not be a parent?
While you have like 2 under 2 or something. Like, I mean, and again, that's not to dismiss the validity of people's feelings or that any of this, of course, like anything, there will be some people that would say they regret it or that would say that they would not choose that again, which for, our intents and purposes today, we can say is the same thing. But one thing I noticed, and I think you mentioned it in one of your Substack posts, is that typically, well, maybe not typically, but often people who say that they are regretful, they hadn't really thoroughly looked at and explored the decision. And from what I've heard, and it's the same they say with the child-free population, including people who are without kids through circumstance, is that those who really consciously said, this is not what I want, this is not for me, I'm building something different, they tend to understandably experience less regret or difficult emotions than someone who maybe really wanted that and wasn't able to make or find peace with that. And of course, there's many examples of, all kinds of folks who wanted kids who could find peaceful, joyful lives. But certainly, if you haven't really maybe thoroughly thought about this, the types of parents, which I saw you also kind of like chuckling at the people who's like, oh, I never thought about it before. Like, you're like, really? And it is a privilege, of course, to be able to consider this. But some of the people I've spoken to who didn't really assess the decision, it is quite shocking. So,
and I think that is one thing that I love to tell people when they're like frustrated at themselves for being unsure or being on the fence is I'm like, good. I'm glad you're on the fence. I'm glad you're thinking this through because in my experience as well, people who don't think about it are much more likely to be overwhelmed, to struggle, because a huge part of also our mental health is how much we beat ourselves up. right? About a decision that we make. So if you have this like false belief that having kids is perfect and amazing and won't be hard and it'll fulfill you, you're going to beat yourself up a lot when you struggle.
True.
Same with if you don't have kids and you imagined everything would be perfect and you would never feel sadness about it, you're also going to beat yourself up. So I think it's really important. And I'm glad to see that there are more people that are openly questioning it. Because I remember when I first started talking, I didn't make my whole account this or have a Substack, but I first started talking openly about this in 2020 when I was on Instagram, just talking to people being like, I don't know whether I'm going to have kids. And I would get so many comments that would kind of be like, if you like, you're a bad mom already for questioning this. And I was just like, how is that? I'm not even a parent yet. I don't even know if I'm going to be a parent. Right. And then you also have the other people that are kind of like, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no. And that drives me insane too, because it is black and white thinking. And in most other choices in our life, we never say that. Like, we don't say to people, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no to like a job that we're considering or getting married or any of these other big decisions. We allow ambivalence and confusion, but for some reason with like having kids or not, we believe, I think because it's like, biology and other things, that you should never have like a negative emotion or you should never question it. And that means something bad about you.
Yeah, I totally agree. Would you say something similar? This idea that people say, like, if you're questioning it, it means it's a no. I often hear that one.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that if you're questioning it, it may mean you're ambivalent, but I think that it's actually really healthy and important. And as a therapist, I love when people tell me they're ambivalent about things because you get to learn so much about why you're ambivalent. I'm just such a big believer in parts work also. And there are different parts of us that can feel different ways. And there's a lot we can learn from different parts of ourselves and wisdom that if we try to just only feel one way, we miss out on the learning.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, I have one or two more questions, and then we're going to do our rapid fire and wrap things up. I'm already inspired to have you back for a future conversation if you will be so good to join me.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing how things evolve with the Fence Setter Substack, which we'll definitely link to in the show notes so people can check that out. I also have shared some of your posts, so keep an eye on my account as well, but definitely go give Amanda a follow. What would you say if somebody's really grappling and on the fence, they've been stuck for a long time? Is there anything that is like a bad thing to be doing? Like something that you feel like is contributing to further confusion and feeling even more like spun out about the whole thing?
I think if you are purposely seeking out extreme content, I think that will make it worse.
Yeah.
Like I would purposely seek out mothers that were very miserable, or, people that were on the fence that didn't have kids that were miserable. And I think I would stay away from extremes.
Yeah. Good advice. Okay, well, today we didn't get to talk too much about how motherhood is thus far. So I'm thinking we should do like a check-in maybe in a few months' time, and we can talk more about like how the first couple of years of your daughter's life have been. But before we wrap things up, I have a few rapid fire questions. So the first two are finish the sentence. Being a mom is?
Fulfilling.
Being a mom is not?
I'm trying to think of the word of like, it doesn't just make everything perfect. Like it doesn't it's not like I never feel lonely or I never feel anything. It didn't
like a fix all, so to speak.
It didn't complete my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer. What is one thing, either like societally or culturally speaking, what have you, that you think would make this decision a little bit easier for women who are on the fence?
Taking the pressure off.
Yeah. Okay. And what is one thing that you would like child-free people to know?
I don't judge you. And I really wish like parents and child-free people could have better relationships. Like, especially as a parent who's only having one, I'm in this place in my life where I'm like seeking out child-free people because I'm like, I don't want to fully 100% go into having many kids and having that totally take over my life. I am looking for people who can still like go grab coffee in the mornings. Yeah.
Totally.
So I think less division.
Okay, awesome. All right. And my last question is, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
Your life will be beautiful either way. you just have to decide. Yeah, I think you just have to decide which life you would rather have.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. Where can people find you? What do they need to know about?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at Therapy for Women. If you're interested in therapy, I have a therapy practice. You can check us out at Therapy for Women Center. We are located in Philadelphia, but we have therapists licensed across the United States in 42 states. You can visit us there if you're interested in a therapist, to support you through this process.
Amazing. I was looking online yesterday. It looks like you have an incredible lineup of supportive therapists for people. So definitely sounds like a great resource for our American listeners.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Amanda. And we'll make sure to link to all of that in the show notes as well. And it sounds like Amanda and I are going to get back together in a few months and see how things are going. So thank you again for the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in for this episode of the Kids or Childfree podcast. Now, I have a few new goodies for you over on the free resources page, which you'll find at kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link to this in today's show notes. And the new resources that I've added are a podcast episode, a secret podcast episode, if you will. It's a recording that I made prior to launching the Kids or Childfree podcast. And it's actually a very personal share of mine related to a situation that happened with a friend of mine. And it really talks about how triggering this kids or child-free decision can be. It's vulnerable. There may or may not be a few tears shed. And it's available exclusively when you head to the free resources page and sign up for it at kidsorchildfree.com. The other resource I recently added is the replay of the event we had earlier in the spring, which was the Between Friends conversation I had with my friend Lauren Grant, who is a filmmaker. She is a mom. And we talked all about how we've maintained our friendship throughout all the ups and downs that motherhood and this decision that I've made has brought. We talk about how you personally can navigate some of the concerns and the challenges that you might be having in your friendships when one of you has kids and the other one doesn't. Again, check it out. That's at kidsorchildfree.com under the free resources tab. Thank you again for listening today, and we'll see you back here soon for another episode of the Kids or Child Free podcast.